The internet is unfortunately rife with radicalization. As more and more real-world social and societal issues get talked about, there will no doubt be people who abuse that to push their ideology onto impressionable minds. With the advent of centralized internet, that becomes easier than ever. More rights being given to groups that have historically been persecuted due to ethnicity, gender, and sexuality is a good thing. However, many people who haven't been in those situations incorrectly equate this as an attack on them. Most of them, though, don't believe what they're saying and only continue to for the sake of fear-mongering to push these groups back into the shadows. But as more and more rhetoric gets spouted, more and more misinformed people begin to believe in it. Today's video is a cautionary tale, a warning as to the dangers that can come from being led astray by the worst the internet and the real world have to offer. The fate of one Nicholas Paul Miller. So there was a small little indie film that released in like 2019. You might have heard of it. It's called The Joker. Leading up to and throughout the film's cinematic release, people accused the film of celebrating violence, facilitating toxic fans, and accusations of sympathizing with incel culture. I'm sure not necessarily helped by the infamous climactic scene that could be misconstrued by some bad faith actors as a almost call to action, saying that if you are belittled and put down, it's okay to take that anger out on someone mostly uninvolved. Cemented by the notorious line, "You get what you deserve." In spite of, or maybe even because of the controversy surrounding it, Joker 2019 became the first R-rated film to generate $1 billion at the global box office, cementing Joaquin Phoenix's new take on the titular villain in pop culture from there on out. Now, of course, despite media outcry, Joker is not an incel movie. However, that didn't stop incels and alt-right extremists alike from twisting the film with aid from the excessive moral outrage in order to fit their own agenda. I thought it'd be funny just like to not say anything about this, but I'm neither, just FYI. Paul Miller falls into the latter category, but I think it goes without saying he wasn't always like this. Originally dreaming of becoming a fighter, Paul began training in Muay Thai and kickboxing in 2008 at the age of 20.
I do Muay Thai and I've been doing it for years.
Going on to compete in numerous tournaments where he was actually very successful, eventually becoming the US national champion for the World Kickboxing Association. However, Miller was tragically hit by a car right as he was about to go pro, cutting his very, very promising career very short. It's very sad to see. It's at points like this where I get caught up a bit thinking about the butterfly effect. The idea that a comparatively small, a completely unrelated event can lead to God knows what. Now, I'm not too knowledgeable about the accident Paul got in. I'll be completely honest when I say that the sources were very few and vague. But whatever happened, it's really interesting to think about where he'd be if it never happened. Something I'm sure he thinks about somewhat often as well. Now, obviously, I'm not calling Paul's accident small, by the way. It's obviously going to be a very life-changing event. I mean, being hit by a car, but also having to give up on something you've been gearing towards for ages at this point. However, you could argue it pales in comparison to what was right around the corner for Paul. It seems to begin with, considering himself an independent journalist, Paul's content primarily consisted of him gamer raging, donning a MAGA hat, and shouting various conservative conspiracy theories. In journalistic spirit, Paul attended a speech at the Metropolitan Republican Club in New York, led by neo-fascist far-right organization, the Proud Boys. However, at this rally, Paul found himself victim to an attack from anti-fascist group Antifa, who had raided the speech.
I'm here with Paul Miller, who was at the Metropolitan Republican Club the evening that Antifa disrupted the speech by Gavin McInnes and the Proud Boys. Now, Paul, thank you so much for joining One American News.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
Now, as mentioned before, Paul was already very right-wing. However, I and many others believe that this would have been the turning point into the significantly more radical Gypsy Crusader. To someone with these beliefs, but significantly less radical at the time, being attacked by a very prominent anti-white supremacy group, and then of course being aided by the group they're attacking, obviously would have pushed him much further down the alt-right pipeline.
You have a very unique story about what happened that night. Tell us about when you first went went down to the club that night, what you saw.
It was just a crowd of about maybe 70, 80 Antifa members screaming and chanting and wild like animals out front of the Republican Club.
These protesters, did they have weapons on them?
I think they did because they had the signs that they were chanting with, and the signs had like these big wood, like the sign was on itself. It was like this big wood piece. It's dangerous.
Like a 2x4 with something in it or something like that?
Yes, and then they had the sign on the top. You could have anything in there, a nail or something, you don't know.
I did smash some dude out there. It was pretty, I didn't want to fight with the guy. He just got in my face, so kind of pushed him away. And it was absolutely insane. It was a good time, and my God, it was crazy, but a lot of fun.
It was around this time that Paul found himself and his mother doxxed and harassed by Antifa members. Should Paul have been doxxed? Well, no, obviously not. As far as I'm aware, while Paul would have definitely had more inclination toward the Proud Boys than Antifa, at that point I genuinely believe Paul was just looking to report on the rally. For that matter as well, I don't think he should have been beat up, but I mean, unless the Antifa members went around asking which of you are Proud Boys, I think it's a fairly understandable mistake to make. Should his mother have been doxxed? Definitely not. Now, I'm of the opinion that doxing is almost never justified, unless, of course, the person is very obviously a danger to themselves and those around them. Doxing someone like, say, Kara the Wolf in order to turn that information over to the proper authorities, yeah, that might be justified, but I mean, there's no reason to bring someone's completely unrelated family into it. It's just out of order. Either way, this turned out to be the last straw for Paul. Following this, he began to consider himself as a sort of virtual vigilante, raiding, recording, and reporting on Antifa protests in New York. His alias, Gypsy Crusader. Paul would initially take up political commentary for what he said to be the good of the Roman communities. Of course, the name Gypsy Crusader being a nod to the Romany heritage on his dad's side, whereas his mother was of Mexican descent. Now, I feel like his heritage is important to mention, because initially, while his right-wing beliefs were less radical, it wouldn't be long before he started expressing some more radical, more in line with white supremacist views. It's really sad, because when you look at like a lot of the online landscape at the moment, there's a ton of non-white people who, for various reasons from various influences, are expressing self-hating white supremacist views. I say this as well because Paul's main thing soon enough would turn into pretending to be white on omegle and crying about imaginary race wars. This would be the beginning of the Gypsy Crusader I'm sure most people would soon become familiar with. Now, believe it or not, I'm not a massive Gypsy Crusader fan. And around this point, the timeline gets a little bit hazy from an outside perspective. And as well, not much really interesting happens. So therefore, I'm not exactly sure when, but at some point, Paul's thing would stop being crashing Antifa rallies and more shouting at children on omegle. I'm sure you saw a clip or two back in the day, back in 2020, Miller. The most famous one arguably being this.
Riddle me this, Batgirl. They are loud and obnoxious. They like music that rhymes. They are a fraction of the population, and they commit half the crimes. Who are they? The answer is, who is the...
Basically, Paul would do the conservative commentator bit of bringing up points that may or may not be technically true, however completely missing and ignoring any social or historical context. Whilst it's true that in 2020, black Americans made up just over a quarter of all arrests, I mean, that's completely ignoring stuff like unreported crimes, cycles of abuse, circumstance, motive, and what crimes they were arrested for. Basically, any context that would make that statistic a lot more reasonable. I mean, there are thousands of explanations online as to why crime rates in black communities are that high, and to be quite frank, I'm not at all qualified to give a topic like that justice. However, from my understanding, the main reason is that as well as police infamously unjustly targeting black people, notoriously in 2020, it's undoubtedly true that the circumstances black people are set up in across the world, but especially in countries like the US and the UK, are insanely unfair and have left some of those communities to resort to crime just to get by, which is obviously not indicative of the people as a whole, which is what Paul is trying to imply. Now, Paul's content, surprise, surprise, was never particularly innovative or all too interesting. I mean, I guess it's kind of funny, but as soon as you go over the shock value, it's just like, Do you know what I mean? Like, just sort of the same everyone else is doing, innit? Omegle trolling, originally something YouTubers would do for a laugh before it became a genre within itself. Nonce catching, pre-recording videos and then playing them through OBS, being an emo. For some reason, cross-dressing was a very big trend, which I mean, fair enough, you know, do what you want. Paul was basically just doing the exact same thing, but where the people on YouTube would upload themselves catching racists on Omegle, Paul would stream to whatever random non-censorship, pro-free speech, anti-woke streaming site, being that racist on Omegle. And it wasn't long until he would be at the forefront of media attention yet again. In November 2020, the Anti-Defamation League reported on the extremists on Omegle, describing Paul in the article as a Florida-based white supremacist from New Jersey who regularly uses racial slurs and racist jokes while harassing Omegle users dressed as supervillain comic book characters, the Riddler and the Joker. The ADL would then subsequently contact the police, leading to the arrest of Paul Miller.
Well, this was an early morning raid. Neighbors describe hearing a lot of commotion around 6 a.m. and that's when agents arrested one man, took him from the home that you see directly behind me. And following that arrest, investigators were on scene all day long for at least 7 hours collecting evidence from that house.
We're learning more details about a man arrested during an FBI raid in Fort Lauderdale. The Anti-Defamation League is identifying 32-year-old Paul Miller as a white supremacist who had appeared in several online videos in costumes while making racist remarks, oftentimes with weapons. The FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force arrested him early Tuesday morning on charges of possessing a firearm by a felon.
Agents with the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force arrested 32-year-old Paul Miller, saying he's a convicted felon and was in possession of a firearm.
But as with all crusades, eventually the empire must fall. Now, this was not the first time Paul was arrested. In 2006, Paul would plead guilty to aggravated assault, and while he avoided prison then, in 2007 he was charged with possession of drugs with intent to sell, landing him almost half a year in prison and 4 years of probation. Because of this drug charge, Paul cannot legally own a firearm. This, however, didn't stop him from waving a couple around on Omegle while streaming, as well as owning one all the way back in January 2018. "I'm armed to the teeth tonight. I have 2 new guns," Miller said before displaying a pistol on a video uploaded to his BitChute account. This was the same stream wherein Paul spoke about his hatred of Jewish people. Miller was arrested and sentenced to 41 months in prison in June 2021 on charges of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, possession of an unregistered firearm by a convicted felon, as well as possession of ammunition by a convicted felon. He reportedly obtained the ammo across state lines, as the specific type of ammo isn't manufactured in Florida. He as well got the skeng by purchasing rifle parts and building it himself, watching tutorials on YouTube, claiming that America is on the brink of collapse and that firearm manufacturing would be a good skill to learn as a result. And with that, the story basically ends. Paul would be let out of pen for good behaviour on supervised release, only to go back to what else but shouting slurs at children on Omegle. Now that Omegle was shut down, he has started shouting slurs at children on Omi TV. And with an active Telegram chat that doubles as a Gypsy Crusader archive, it doesn't seem like Paul's going to stop anytime soon. Despite everything, I do genuinely feel quite bad for Paul. With as notorious as his content is, with how public his identity is, and therefore how easy it is to do a basic background check, Paul has basically rendered himself completely unemployable. I mean, if the streams weren't enough, if his online stuff weren't enough, I mean, the numerous arrests and reasons for definitely aren't going to help his case. Which, I mean, only makes me wonder how he's going to get by, because realistically this isn't really sustainable as a career. Paul does sell merch and has been since before and throughout his incarceration. However, buying various alt-right insignia sold by a very vocal white supremacist who is already likely being watched by the FBI is maybe not like a very good idea, and as spot up by the user in what I believe to be Paul's Telegram, Miller now has a metric load of right-wingers doxers on his devices, because giving your address to a mentally unstable ex-convict is shockingly a horrible fucking idea. Either way, Paul has made his bed. I mean, going back to the idea of the butterfly effect that I brought up earlier, in some alternate universe, maybe a significantly less radicalized Paul Miller would have found a successful career in teaching Muay Thai. And I mean, that's the sad part. It's something he'll never know, and he has to live with that forever. Even if he knew deep down it wasn't his passion, if he wanted to do something else, maybe it was political content, I'm sure what he's doing now isn't his passion either. Alright, so I know it's been a while. I've been working on and off on a pretty big video that I've been wanting to do for a while at this point. It's been over a year. I've been working on that with a good friend of mine, Spinling, who you should check out. But that's it. That's going to be delayed potentially quite a bit longer because there's going to be some more stuff coming out, yeah? In the meantime, I'm going to be working on some other videos. I want to come back, you know? It's been a while. I've missed this. I miss this, this little video making thing. You and I, us two. My dear subscribers. And so, yeah, if you're new, you should definitely stick around. You should definitely watch some of the older stuff I've done. It still holds up just a bit. It's quite good. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it, and I want it to be the starting point into, you know, getting back into it. I say that every year. It's always my New Year's resolution. You know, this time I'm gonna make it stick. I'm gonna make more than 3 videos this year. Promise. So anyway, follow me on Twitter at h_hahayeah. Hahayeah was taken. Unfortunately, I'm going to be launching a Discord server again. I made one ages ago that I deleted because I couldn't be bored with it. But yeah, I'm going to be. I've made a new one. You can check that in the description if you want to keep up. And so I think that's about it. I've been hahayeah. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.